who are interested in the session, please come inside and we close the doors inside. Welcome everyone, big welcome to not a big group, but I understand a very motivated group and very high-level group ready to discuss the problems of athletes representation. My name is Paulina Tomczyk. I'm the General Secretary of EU Athletes, which is a federation of player unions and athletes associations. So, of course, the topic is very relevant and very interesting to me, and I'm looking forward to hearing the presentations and then engaging in the discussion with our panelists. So we have, from my right, Giel Warners from WADA Athletes Committee, who will talk about the challenges of, in a way, reforming WADA Athletes Committee and the work that they have been doing so far. Then we have Maximilian Seltmann from German Sport University Cologne, who will present his research on giving athletes veto power. Further, we have Benjamin Bendrich, who's from the Universität. I'm not going to try to pronounce. You can see it there on the screen. Yeah. And he will also present his research related to giving athletes power within the structures of sports. And finally, we have James Tompkins, who some of you may have seen already during the opening session on Sunday, who will talk about the IOC Ethics Commission and its place within the Olympic movement. So, without further ado, we're gonna start. Now I would like to invite Benjamin for his presentation.
Yeah, hello everyone. I'm going to talk about today. First of all, my name is Benjamin Bendrich, and the title of my presentation is Athletes Within the Power Structure of Elite Sports, Breaking the Barrier of Neglect. I will especially talk about German athletes representation and also some international aspects. So first of all, what did I say? Yeah, okay. First of all, the outline of my presentation. So the brief summary of my study, it's an extensive literature research with qualitative interviews with German athletes and athletes representatives. And today I will talk about why athletes activism is on the rise worldwide in Germany, about Athletes Germany, the independent athletes representation, about Rule 40, the changes in Germany, athletes representation of individual sports in Germany, and international athletes representation. First of all, why is athlete activism on the rise internationally? I think I don't have to talk about all the points. Obviously, most important are the international doping scandals. Many athletes felt they weren't heard about the problems, or they weren't heard, their voice weren't heard, so they were really fed up with different federations like WADA and IOC. Then we still have a power imbalance regarding, in the different boards and committees, we have a power imbalance. Most of the boards, the athletes are in a clear minority. We had sexual case abuses not only in the United States, but also in Canada, Germany, and Great Britain. There were, athletes are fed up with all the cover-ups and mistreatments, abuse, bullying, and discrimination. There's a massive injection of capital, but the capital doesn't go into the athletes, also because of Rule 40. We had some changes made in Germany and Australia and the United States, but in all other countries we still have the problem. There are some political considerations in the United States and Italy to really limit the autonomy of sport by retracting, for example, licenses of different federations if they don't care about their athletes. Then many athletes in Germany were also fed up with the Athletes Forum 2019. They criticized that they really didn't write on the paper, and what really needs more focus in general by probably more athletes representatives is the topic with women with high testosterone. In Germany, it's a little bit different. Obviously, the German athletes were also fed up with the Russia doping scandal, but also we have some other problems as well. The structure of elite sports, for example, a lot of German athletes have to go through the army to get financial support. We have made some changes already, but I think there are still some problems. Then we have dual career problems. Many athletes want to study at the university, but there are some serious problems regarding time management and so on. Also, at the moment, we have elite sports reform in Germany. So a lot of sports get centralized. That's a problem for a lot of athletes because they have to change places, they have to leave their family and so on, and that's why a lot of athletes speak up. And we also had a litany of scandals in Germany that were serious, and that's why a lot of athletes woke up and tried to speak up. And we still don't know how much money the IOC is giving to the National Olympic Committee in Germany, so we don't know the amount, and the athletes don't know the amount, and they are fed up with it. And yeah, then in Germany we still don't talk about all the abuse cases. Over the last decades we had about 200,000 abuse cases in sport, and nobody really is talking about it. Now to Athleten Deutschland, Athletes Germany. They didn't feel they can bring change to German elite sports within the NOC in Germany, so they tried to get independent. They got a government grant over 450,000 euros. They now have an athlete's voice in independent. They have legal support. They have a new CEO, and they established a network, or they established networks, new networks. And very important was the Rule 40 change in Germany, also for the athletes' representation, because it gave them legitimacy to really, for everything, because now a lot of athletes saw that this independent group can change something. Regarding Rule 40, I won't get into detail. A lot of athletes are now allowed to have sponsorship deals, new and ongoing. They can use terms like Summer Olympics and gold. They can also use certain competition and non-competition pictures, and they also can use social media during the Olympic Games. I think that could be a game changer because we know how important social media today is, and the conclusion is that also IOC is not allowed to exclude any German athletes if they violate the Rule 40 from the Olympic Games. These changes are only applicable to Germany, but other European athletes should sue the NOCs because under European law and German law, it's abusive of conduct. And I don't see why it's a big problem, because it would be, I think, a modernization of the game if regional sponsors could talk during the Olympic Games with their athletes. Now, to some of the findings regarding athletes representatives in the individual sport. There we have some other problems. So some of them of the athletes representatives in Germany, they weren't elected. They were selected by the federation in the past. So that's very interesting. They were intentionally selected because they felt they were federation friendly, but not all of them. Then all of them say they don't have the financial support and the time to do their job as an athlete representative. Sometimes they even felt neglected by their officials, so officials don't answer emails right away, wait, or even make fun of them. So the power structure is for all the athlete representatives in the individual sports a big problem. They also say they have no legal background, so sometimes they can't even help their fellow athletes because they don't have the knowledge. And they fear repercussions by their federations. So they sometimes are afraid that they are not nominated for national teams or that their financial support could get cut. Sometimes also athletes get mistreated by officials. For example, before open discussions, officials try to put pressure on the athletes to don't say certain things, or they even bring older tweets or old newspaper articles and put pressure on them. Athletes representatives on top, like in the Independent Athletes Commission, have a certain protection by the media in Germany because they get a lot of attention, as we can see at the moment, but all the athletes representatives in the individual sport, they don't have this kind of protection. That's a problem. So abuse of power is always possible in the individual sport. Some of the athletes said they feel ashamed that they cannot help their fellow athletes. Others said They don't really care, they just were looking for the position, and it wasn't a big deal. What everybody, or most of the athletes said, that they have a big mistrust regarding sensitive material to give them to officials. Implications for the future. I won't talk about the achievable points. So there are a lot of things that athletes in Germany can achieve or have already achieved, but there are also certain things that are harder to achieve to really have a power shift. For example, on the right side you can see the 50-50 quota within the different boards and committees would be a goal to have a real power shift. I will go into that in a minute. And the power shift would also prevent abuse and malpractice. The protection of athletes' representatives in the individual sport is very important, and that's still hard to achieve. Also, a compensation maybe and an expense allowance for athletes' representatives in the individual sport should be a goal. Legislative changes would be another option. So we don't have an Elite Sports Act in Germany, and I think it would be a good idea to do something like that. The establishment of unions in the individual sport is very hard in Germany. We already realize that, we can see it in different sports, that it's hard to establish. Also, but I think it's a good thing. Then, Athleten Deutschland will need more money in the future if they want to provide all these services. So, if you look at Athleten Deutschland, is it an international prototype for athletes' representation? I'm not sure. I would say it's a piece of the puzzle. The most important thing for me is, I can see it begins with independence, but it ends with responsibility for the athlete. That means, if the athletes really get the 50-50 quota in different committees, they have responsibility. They have to decide what they want to do, and they have to be responsible for the things they do afterwards. They cannot blame anymore the system. They cannot blame officials. They have made the decision when they are in a committee or a board where they have 50% of the votes. So that's, I think, the biggest or the most important thing. Regarding the Athletes Commission from the IOC, a lot of German athletes criticize that there is no direct connection to the Athletes Committee of the IOC. So we have a voting process from the individual athlete up to the athlete representative, to the German Athletes Commission, and then they also influence the European Athletes Commission. But there is no real connection to the IOC Athletes Commission, and that's what a lot of athletes criticize, because the IOC Athletes Commission is voted at the Olympic Games during the 2 weeks of the Olympic Games, and most athletes don't have the time to really look at the campaign of the different athletes, what they are standing for. Yeah. And a lot of German athletes criticize that the IOC Athletes Commission is isolated and it's really a break of the chain. So, in conclusion, athletes are still awful scapegoats. It's a runaway commercialism. I wrote a lot in the past about the NCAA, and we use a lot the word indentured servitude. It works for the IOC as well. Yeah, you get a little bit of food, you get a shelter, you get an expense allowance at the Olympic Games, but nothing else. Then, athletes don't want to take away the money from the IOC. German athletes don't want to take away. They just want to have a piece of the pie. Yeah, the Agenda 2020 is a zealous defense of bogus principles, like Taylor Brent said about the NCAA. Rule 40 is indirect price fixing. Athletes should be permitted to thank their regional sponsors. It's very important. And there is a disconnection between the IOC Athletes Commission and all the other athletes commissions around the world. But also, there is a danger that there could be a possible disconnection between Western world athlete representatives and other athletes representatives in the future. I hope it's not the case, but it could happen. Outlook, future. There are threats loom on multiple fronts: athletes, courts, politics, breakaway movements, and public disgust. What we need is checks and balances, culture of compliance, independent representation, protection of athletes' representatives, also unions are very important. The quota, maybe if nothing works, we also have to think about separation. And also very important in the next few years are new sports acts and court decisions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Benjamin, of this very interesting presentation. I'm sure during the discussion you will also be able to discuss, especially with James, regarding your points on IOC. We will have some time for that later. And now I would like to ask Maximilian to present his research.
Well, thank you very much for showing up and for joining my presentation. My name is Maximilian. I work at German Sports University Cologne at the Institute of European Sport Development and Leisure Studies. We really do like long names, and so my title has been cut by the organizers. It was originally the title of my master thesis, and I'm going to present on giving athletes veto power, game theory and policy making in German sport. And I want to start off with some of the quotes and some of the voices we've heard over those last days here at Play the Game. I didn't put the names on it, but you might remember who said it. It is essential to listen to athletes. No decision without the athletes. That's been the official claim of Athleten Deutschland when they started. Athletes need to have an equal say. This is the signature move of Schwab and his association of world players. And my all-time favorite, include athletes in the sausage-making process. So that's definitely topping the list. Now, these statements are not completely new. So academics have brought forth such claims over the past decades, probably, and we've already heard from Benjamin that there are those claims that something is happening. So I took those claims by heart, and then I came across a very interesting study, or basically two studies, by Professor Peter Donnelly, and he asked a very intriguing question. What if the players controlled the game? And that's become the main question of my study, and I want to use it to outline what I tried to do in my research. So what if points to the hypothetical nature of this research. So I apply an explorative case study design, and it will be theory loaded, you will learn in a minute. The players in this research is the political representative body of German athletes, which is the German Olympic Sports Confederation's Athletes Commission. Then controlled, I understand as the capacity to co-determine outcomes of policy making, and you will see that this really requires some theoretical thinking on that. And lastly, the games I want to look into is policy making in German elite sport, and more specifically, two of the largest reforms we've had in Germany over the past, let's say, probably 35 years, which is the reform of elite sport funding and the anti-doping law. Now, as I said, I would have to spend a lot of time on theory now, but I want to give a very short glimpse into how I understand the capacity to co-determine outcomes of policy-making games. I for this rely on Professor Zebelis' very famous veto player theory, and he argues that policy outcomes are the result of veto player constellations. Now, veto players are those actors whose agreement is necessary for a change of the status quo. He then distinguishes between institutional veto players. Those generally are those that are defined by the constitution of a country. And for example, in Germany, it would be the German Bundestag, the German parliament. But then there is also partisan veto players. Those are those players that come up during the game. So the game produced those players, and the constitutional veto players give the right to veto to those players. And for example, in Germany, the German Olympic Sports Confederation has enjoyed this right in most of the policy making. Now, I will skip that for time reasons. Zebelis applies spatial modeling to run this analysis, and it ends up in something akin to this. So I'll try to make it very short. So you break down the policy issue into 2 dimensions or more dimensions. Most of the people do it in 2 dimensions. Then you operationalize the dimensions, so you assign an operationally meaningful meaning to every point in this scale. You can then insert the status quo, which would be the red point on the bottom line, and then insert the preferences of every veto player. Now, the theory relies on rational choice assumptions and draws indifference curves around every veto player's preference. They circle around the preference at the center and through the status quo. Now, every veto player is only willing to accept policy changes that are closer to his preferences, so within his circle. And then we have 3 areas where circles overlap. That's where everyone would agree. The unanimity core, which I show with the triangle, this is where unanimity can be found. And then the red area, that is eventually where the new policy can be located. And now it's up to the agenda setter to make a proposal that is closest to his point, but also constrained by the red area. Now, if we take the black veto player as an example, as the agenda setter, the new agenda would be the green dot here. So far, so good. Sorry for bothering you with that. So that's what I tried to do in my study. I modeled the 2 reforms and then added the DOSB Ethics Commission as an additional veto player to see if something would have changed. I argue that this step of adding the Ethics Commission democratizes this policy-making system. I built that argument on Dahl's 1956 concept of polyarchy. If you are interested in more theory, just see me. Now, I fast forward to the results. The reform of elite sport funding basically centers around 2 questions. Who gets what? This is represented by the concentration issue on the x-axis, and how. How do they get the money? Which is represented on the y-dimension, transparency. Now we end up with a 5 veto player constellation consisting of the Federal Ministry of the Interior, the BMI, on the top right-hand corner, the two government parties, the Christian Democratic Union and the Social Democratic Party, the Sports Minister Conference. Germany is a federal state, so we do have sports ministers in all of the 16 states that jointly together formulate policy preferences, and the German Olympic Sports Confederation. Now what we see is that the reform has caused changes in terms of concentration, so it concentrates the funds on lesser federations, and in terms of transparency, so the reform has caused or has brought up a new funding mechanism that is supposed to be more transparent than the previously existing one. Now, if we add the DOSB Ethics Commission, the athletes made strong claims in terms of transparency. They wanted to have a numerical figures assigning values and then assigning the money to each and every individual federation. And they made a strong claim for not having individual federations cut off of funding. So adding those to this model, and we see that nothing would really happen. So the new policy that has been adopted in 2016 lies within the preferences of the athletes. Now, if we go to, so no change. If we go to the preferences that have been attained, that's an indicator you can use in this theory. We still see that the athletes have gained policy preferences, that policy attainment has been achieved by the athletes, even when they did not have veto power. Now, if we go to the anti-doping law, this law, or in this law, it has been discussed to include 4 characteristics. One of which it would be to criminalize self-doping, the liability of possession of small amounts, a principal witness rule, and a new category of sport fraud. Now, as you can see on the right-hand side picture, the principal witness rule and sport fraud have not made it into the text of the law, but the possession of small amounts and self-doping have become criminalized under the new law. You might have heard from Mrs. Gottsman the other day about the law. So this has been a paradigmatic change in German sport policy and in sports law. Now if we add the athletes and their preferences to this chart, we see that the athletes, they have raised concerns with both of the dimensions because they didn't know where it would take them. It caused some serious insecurity in terms of their legal embedment into the German system, and they feared that they are now more liable to criminal, persecution, thank you, and that their surrounding, which is supposedly not as professional as people would think, does not make up for that liability. So athletes have preferred to remain with the status quo of the existing laws that have existed before the policy making. So policy deadlock would have occurred and the law could not have been adopted if the athletes had policy veto power in the policy making of this law. Now to sum that up, quickly to answer the question, what would happen if we can't really say from these examples, it's two examples, it's a case study design, but we see that it may have led to policy, to different policy outcomes than we nowadays have in Germany, but we do not have generalizable results here. It really depends from case to case. But seeing that, especially in terms of anti-doping policy, things would have changed. The study confirms previous findings that argue that including the athletes in policy making in anti-doping policy especially would have caused significant effects on the policy outcomes. So in that sense, it does argue that things would have been different. To sum up the athlete's position in general, this is a very broad generalization, and athletes in generally want certainty and security. Financial security for the reform of the elite sport funding, and legal certainty, what is happening if people put doping material into my backpack. So these things have been solved, and I think athletes have changed their positions on the currently existing anti-doping law and are now in favor of it. But back in 2014, 2015, they have not been because of the uncertainties. So what's next? Some recommendations from the study for sport governing bodies. Sport governing bodies should incorporate the preferences of athletes if the legitimate representative role in policy making is to be maintained. Now, we see an increasing, that athletes are increasingly becoming the source of legitimacy for sport governing bodies. This is no new argument, and it's a pretty simple argument. If there is a people that is being governed by some kind of government or governance system, a democratic approach to this governance sees the people, or the demos as theory would call it, as a legitimizing force of the system. This is mostly brought up in European governance and on the backside then, because people would argue because there is no European demos, there can be no European democratic system. But athletes have done a pretty good job, especially in Germany, in stressing that they have united to become some kind of politically active people that now seeks to either legitimize or delegitimize the sport governing bodies. And if we have a look back at the reform of elite sport funding, the DOSB has done a pretty bad job seeing the difference or the distance between the ideal point of the DOSB and the German Athletes Commission in representing the preferences of the athletes. Yes. Some recommendations for the athletes. Stress this role. Stress the legitimizing role of athletes for sport governing bodies and connect globally. I'm just starting to imagine what happened if the athletes truly connected globally and formed some kind of global demos that challenges the legitimacy of the sport governing bodies worldwide. Now, from the study, we also see that it will be a long way for athletes to really gain veto power if they ever should. But we also see from the analysis that some players have preferences that are pretty close to the preference of the athletes. I call them policy allies. And the athletes should make use of those allies and influence them to move even closer to their own preferences, to really determine the outcomes. So athletes need to identify those allies and influence the currently existing veto players to have preference attainment. Now I'll end with a quick word on where to go for academics. It's been really hard to find studies or to find cases where we can apply veto player theory because much policy making is made within the sports governing bodies, and we don't really have access and we don't really have a theoretical lens to put on that. So we need to do a better job in understanding the rules that apply to policy making in sports as academics in order for us to improve the governance and inform evidence-based policy making. So I'll end with that. I included the references in the slides if someone is interested in digging a bit deeper, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Maximilian. And now I would like to ask James who will talk to us about the IOC Ethics Commission.
Good morning, good afternoon everyone. Thanks for coming along, and I'm delighted to present the IOC Ethics Commission and the makeup, what we're doing, and some of the programs that we're delivering. And one of the things that's come out of the conversations the last few days is, and in the sessions and also informally, is that there's no one perfect model. There's a lot of different models out there. And with collaboration and sharing of best practice, sharing of surveys, sharing of ideas, we can become far more effective in raising that voice. So a little bit about who we are, our programs, as I said, and some of the initiatives. So we're essentially 17 of us. The majority are elected, and then to ensure gender diversity and also regional diversity, Kirsty Coventry, the chair of the Athletes Commission, along with the president, Thomas Bach, appoint some additional members just to ensure that we get that coverage. In fact, gender diversity is a bit of an issue at the moment because we don't have enough men on the commission, so we're looking for more men on that front. We also have what we call athlete liaisons, so we engage and invite the chairs of the continental associations to join. So we're trying to spread the breadth, both information on the way out as well as gathering their concerns and thoughts and ideas, as well as working with representatives from the World Olympians Association and the IPC. The World Olympians Association represents all the retired Olympians, and IPC with Chelsea, of course. And the global network, as you can see, and you're not surprised that the Olympic rings are at the centre. That was another joke. My jokes are going well. So that's our global network, and we're engaging with all athlete representatives across all different areas. Our bread and butter are the National Olympic Committees and the international federations. And in fact, the international federations are probably the best organised. Their athlete commissions are really well organised, they're well supported, and the federations really look to those athletes to help with policy making, decision making, and guidance for those federations. And in fact, we heard from Sarah Lewis from FIS talking about the value that athletes provided in that federation. The NOCs, 207 of them, 207 athlete commissions. Some are equally as well organised as the international federations, but you have the opposite. You have the extreme at the other end, where some are really unorganised and almost to the point of non-existent and therefore ineffective. So that's a real challenge for us. We are represented across most of the commissions within the IOC, so Han from the USOPC is talking about getting involved at the decision-making level. We're trying to do that, have an athlete's voice across all of the commissions. We also have athlete representation across all of the coordination commissions. So again, the coordination commissions of future games, having athletes involved in that process all the way through. On top of that, we're involved in continental associations and our local NOCs as well. So really trying to spread the athlete voice across as much as we can. But we realise that the evolution of an athlete commission, often, I mentioned the historical component the other day of 1981 to now, that often it starts with a bang, a lot of ideas, a lot of activity, and gradually slows down to become very reactive to issues. And we realised that 2016, 2017, that we were reacting, and so we wanted to try and get ahead of the curve again. And so we developed the strategy paper, and two aspects. One, our role with athletes, and then, as Max's research suggested, the role within the Olympic movement and the sports movement, and the power of that movement. So I'm going to concentrate on the role with athletes. The first pillar is empowering athlete commissions. And there's two aspects to that. One, giving the NOC and IF athletes commissions the tools and the equipment to organise themselves, to run effective meetings, that's agenda, terms of reference, how to provide a secretariat role, so that they can actually get organised, form opinions, form decisions, and try and help their federations or NOCs. And the second aspect of that pillar one is to empower them with information. Try and give them as much information in a timely manner that they can provide or come to informed decisions. The second pillar is actually direct athlete support, both on and off the field of play. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that shortly. And if we do both of those pillars well, the legitimacy and the power of that athlete role within the sport movement, within the Olympic movement, becomes far more powerful. And again, referring to Max's presentation, starts to legitimise that role. Those direct programs, there's a whole bunch of them. These are the priorities of the Athletes Commission based on all the feedback from that network that I mentioned earlier. But I wanted to also touch on, communication is a massive issue. With such a large network, we employ many channels of communication, from direct strategy to our digital platform, Athlete 365, and more recently, the quarterly conference calls. So we invite all of the athlete leaders from around the world to join a quarterly conference call where two aspects. One, to provide timely and timely information. And in fact, 2 weeks ago we had a call and we were talking about the LIMS data coming out of Russia. So we had two people from WIDA, the chair of the CRC, talking about that issue and ensuring that the athletes that were on that call were fully informed. And of course it provides a fantastic feedback loop as well. The other form of direct engagement often occurs at games time. We do a lot of the programs, but we realise that at games time, athletes are there to compete. And they're focused and they don't want to be distracted. So we realised that a lot of the information that we wanted to deliver, we should do well beforehand. And so in June this year, we started a separate portal on the Athlete 365, talking about all of the information about Tokyo and what the athletes can expect, anything that they need to know, to try and get them up to speed ahead of the curve and not leave it to the last minute of games time. And it's been going since June of this year, so we're really happy with the network reach. One of the other fantastic programs, and an example of the reach, is the Career Plus program. And we've heard the transition from athlete to post-athletic career is really, really important. So there's that transitional aspect, but also dual career. trying to educate, trying to get athletes to understand that they should be paying attention to their dual career and transition whilst they're actually competing. And it's been incredibly successful, running for about 10 years now, 45,000 athletes connected both digitally and directly. And so far this year we've had 1,000 athletes attend workshops. The athlete declaration was by athletes, for athletes, huge amount of input from all the stakeholders. It was adopted in Pyeongchang. It's part of the Olympic Charter now, reference in the Charter, adopted by the session in Pyeongchang. But I'll stress it's a live document. So in fact we're reviewing it next year. We'll be inviting all stakeholders to provide input into that process. So as I said, it's a live document. We'll continue to evolve. Medal reallocation is really key. Again, we heard a lot about redress. So one form of redress for cheats is, and the athletes that are affected by cheating, is medal reallocation. Again, this was really important for us to provide athletes their chance to receive their moment on the podium. In the past, that wasn't the case. So they've now got options. The athlete can choose how they want to have their medal reallocation done. It can be in Olympic Games, World Championships, or a private function in their hometown. I was involved with one of the Australian walkers who was promoted to a gold medal, and he had his medal reallocation ceremony in his home city of Melbourne at lunchtime in the centre of the city on a working day, and there was 5,000 people that attended, and it was a fantastic ceremony. It was absolutely pumped. So to give the athletes that chance to participate in that is absolutely fundamental. And then we get down to quite a granular level and quite a reactive level, and a certain amount of immediacy. And we know that AIBA has been suspended because of corruption issues, but we didn't want to suspend the athletes. We still want the athletes to be able to compete at the Olympics and not be held accountable along with the federation. So a boxing task force was organised. Emma, my colleague who was here, is on that task force to ensure that those athletes within the boxing community can still compete, irrespective of the federation being suspended. But we also wanted to ensure that the athletes the boxing athletes still had a voice. So we've, at the moment there's a group of 10 boxing ambassadors being organised, gender equitable and regional representation as well. The forum earlier this year, the biggest one so far, over 350 athlete leaders from that network which I mentioned before, and it really drives a lot of the conversation and a lot of our agenda. And the 2015 forum, safeguarding, which out of that came toolkits and abilities to help, abilities for athlete commissions to help with forming policy and procedures. 2017, the strategy I mentioned, and actually and supporting continental forums. So each continent now has an athlete forum, and more recently mental health and the empowering of ACs via support with direct funding. And we've also got a fantastic staff at the IOC who are predominantly all athletes or ex-athletes that help as well, and helps us deliver a lot of these programs. Thank you very much.
Thank you, James. And last but not least, we're going to hear from Gil about WADA Athletes Committee and his work within this structure.
Thank you. I feel a little bit PowerPointless, but it's because Paulina only told me this morning that I was to do this presentation. I'd like to actually talk about two things, if that's okay with you. One is the WADA AC, but also the project Jens also mentioned in his speech this week, which ties in with this subject. I think talking about why athletes need to be represented, we don't need to do that anymore. I think it's pretty clear these last days, but on how we do this is not so clear. This is also something the WADA Reform Group on Governance acknowledges. They had a report last year and they said, we have standing committees within WADA. The WADA Athletes Committee is a special one in this case. It's not just an advisory group, it's a little bit more, but it's not fully representative. So we took this to heart and we formed a working group to make sure we get more representative with experts. Also Jens is in there, Christina. Just to make sure we get the experts from the outside, but also the athletes. So we've been working on this for almost a year now. Basically, in the end, the goal, if we get more representative, we want that seat at the table, that voting seat at the table, which we don't have at the moment. We've given feedback to the WADA Athletes Committee. We got their input. We got feedback from the WADA Exco, and we sent out a survey to international athletes. And basically, they said, the direction you're going is the right one. Also something else that came out of it, and I'll come back to that later, is a strong call for more interaction. You showed a forum, we had a forum last year, and those things are really appreciated by athletes. So the starting point for us to be more representative is we still want to have a strong, expert and diverse AC. But also there's practical matters to take into account. If you want to have an election for all athletes in the world to choose your WADA Athletes Committee, that's not going to work. WADA is just not equipped for that. So there needs to be a model that makes compromises in certain areas just to be practical. So one of the debates we had is about election versus nomination. We can also opt for indirect election. And we also found out there's more ways to be representative than just to be elected. For instance, the forum is one. If you interact with your constituents, with athletes, to listen to them, what do you need, but also to be accountable to them. Tell them, this is what we're going to do, this is what we've done, and tell us, are we doing the right thing? So representation is more than just being elected. So far, the survey, the WADA AC, and also the EXO, they've said, you've gone in the right direction. But it's not always been welcomed with open arms, the change we are suggesting. Recently, with the changes in terms of reference, we see some struggles with people adjusting to the role of athletes, the athletes committee being more than just an advisory group. So there still needs to be some hurdles taken to actually get a proper seat at the table. But also to just have accepted what we are working on. Basically everybody says we're going in the right direction, the most important people, but it does need to be accepted by the organization we are part of. So we hope we can make a strong case to do that. And in that we just need, most importantly, is the support of the athletes in the survey, but also other athlete committees need to make sure. If you want to support a strong athlete's voice at the table, at WADA, make sure you support us there. Something that would potentially help in this is the project we're going to do together with, also Play the Game. It's called, I'm not a fan of the name by the way, we need to still work on that, Jens. It's called Strengthening Athlete Power in Sport, for short SAPIS. We got an Erasmus grant for that recently, which we are very happy with. And basically we are looking to, the objective is to strengthen athletes' influence and representation in sport. And how do we do this? Basically we try to find out what is being done, what kinds of athlete representation is there, what can we find in literature. We basically make a map of that, just to make it accessible. And this not only goes for the athletes, but it also goes for the federations, for the NOCs, for whatever organization they are part of, or not even part of an organization such as a EU athletes. You're on your own outside of the sports organizations. So we basically want to see the whole field, but from both sides. So if you want to have a strong working athletes representation, you need to be welcomed by the organization you're part of. So we want to see also the barriers from the other side potentially. So that's going to be a very interesting project, I think. We want to make it practical. We not just want to make a big literature, a big paper out of it. We also want to make sure we engage with the athletes, make sure we have something accessible which they can work from. Potentially best practices is if you want to set up your athletes representation, these are the ways you can do it. Just engage with athletes and empower them, because I think at least from my perspective, when I talk to athletes, a lot of the time they struggle with, we want to do something, but we don't know how. So we can make it easier and more accessible for them to see, okay, these are the options you have. And you can also take these options and also add some options for the federation you're potentially part of, and you can tell them, okay, you are struggling, maybe you want to give athletes a voice, but you don't know how. So we want to make it easier on both sides. So we definitely be coming back to a lot of you to talk about this in the coming 3 years, I think. So that is going to be a very exciting project, and I think the exciting thing for me is it's not part of any specific group, so hopefully it's neutral and it just builds something everybody can use in making the athlete's voice stronger, because we all agree on it. We just need to do it now. It's a bit of a tricky phrase, just do it at the moment, but it's yeah, you don't get it yet. No? I'll tell you later. Something to do with Salazar or something. But I think, I hope you all are willing to help with this. And hopefully, maybe in 2 years or the next Play the Game conference, we have some nice results to show. That's it.
Thank you, Kim. And also, indeed, thank you for accepting this very short notice and joining the panel that was sent to you yesterday evening. So even more, thank you for this very good presentation. And I think it's a very valuable addition to our great panel that we're going to open the discussion in a second. I just will use my chair privileges to ask the first question, if I may. I think we talk a lot about the elected or appointed representatives, and that is the very big debate at the moment. But I'm wondering about the possibility for athletes to remove a person from their position if they're no longer suited to be there. So I'm first wondering if in the IOC Ethics Committee, in what Ethics Committee does that exist? Is there a possibility to remove someone from the commission, and for which reasons? And also if remaining members of the panel wants to add some points in that.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, indeed. There's terms of reference and obligations of AC members of the IOC, and in fact, there's been 2 that have been removed in the last few years. I won't name names, but because of inactivity. So there is an obligation to athletes who have elected us. There's an obligation to each other on the commission to work and contribute and do as much as they can. So a couple weren't doing that, and they're being removed. And then one other actually removed themselves. So when they realised they couldn't actually contribute. So there is that capacity, and it has happened.
Yes, the same for the WADA AC. Basically, if you want to be on the AC, you need to be active. So when you come in, there are terms of reference also, and something is expected of you. The process is a little different because we are appointed by the WADA Exco. So in the end, those are the ones that formally need to remove somebody as well. Correct me if I'm wrong, Becky?
Yeah, and it's attendance based. So if you miss more than 2 meetings, because there's only 2 meetings in a year, then you're removed.
But the reform has built in the executive committee power.
Maybe we can get the mic so we can hear you a bit better, Rob?
That's just one of the comments.
Okay, I didn't hear.
All I said was the reform document, Becky, correct me if I'm wrong as well, but in WADA is the executive committee now has the power to remove someone from the WADA athlete committee. So that's where that's what the proposed reform is. Not the athlete committee themselves.
I appreciate really this question about elected representation, and I think that's something we will have to work with also in the process. That's also something we've discussed in this Water Athlete Commission group, where it was simply practically very, very difficult to find solutions over a short period of time, pardon my ignorance, but I know that in earlier days it was the elections for the IOC Ethics committees were all, I would almost say, carried out blindfolded to the extent that no athlete could campaign for anything or explain her or his viewpoints, and I think that's a very, very limited basis, you could say, for representative democracy. Well, how far are you now allowed to explain your viewpoints, engage in discussions, put up websites, make information about yourself available? How does that work?
So there's a lot of avenues now for the candidates to put forward their platform across a whole different raft of media platforms, and personally in videos during games time as well, and on Athlete 365 portal. Just a little bit of history around that. So in Beijing, there was a huge, I don't know if there's any athletes here that were in Beijing, but the campaigning was out of control. Like the candidates were lined up in front of the dining hall. So every time you went to the dining hall, you were just inundated by the athletes trying to give you things, trying to direct you over to the voting booth and hold your hand and almost write it down for you. So the IOC said that is enough, and in a fairly heavy-handed way, they said zero campaigning for the next round. Clearly, to the point that you're making, that's unworkable. So it's gradually being relaxed, and I think Tokyo is a really good balance where the athletes can promote themselves across a whole whole number of platforms, and can get their viewpoints across and provide the athletes at the Olympics what they're actually standing for and what they're prepared to do.
Okay. Are there any more questions from the audience? Yes, please, Rob.
I wanted to ask this question yesterday with the governance leadership, so I'm going to ask it to the group up here. I've been attending several athlete groups and committee meetings that I've been fortunate to attend. And one of the things I'm finding is the leadership of the organizations continually talk about the importance of the athlete, athletes first, athletes number one, our most important stakeholder. But yet they get in the room with leaders and they're intimidated, they're misinformed, and the power imbalance is so obvious, it puts the athletes in a very difficult position. I don't think it's a secret that I promote and support the collective and having professional staff to represent athletes and the athletes' views. My question is, and it goes to all of you, why do you think, and I wish I would have asked Pound and Sarah Lewis this question, but why do you think when there's so much to gain from engaging the athletes, there's so much to gain to help developing the rules together with the athletes? I'm not talking about money, I'm talking about developing sport the way athletes would like to see it, and probably the population would like to see it. Why is there such a resistance from organizations, do you think, for not embracing the concept of a collective where 50% of the discussion and the vote goes with the athlete and having someone represent them? Where do you think the barrier is? Why do you think it's there? And how do we overcome that? In your position as athletes, how do you think the best way to go forward?
That's a good fundamental question. Who would like to start?
Maybe the researchers.
It was too difficult, no one wants to start.
Then I'll start if nobody starts. I think in essence with people, all change is difficult, and that also goes for people in power positions. So they basically need to let something go they've been holding on for a long time. So that is difficult, and it might change from organization or person to person why that is difficult exactly. I think that's why the research we want to do also goes from the side of the person who needs to let athletes in, to make sure to say, okay, athletes' involvement can be valuable, and these are the ways you can do it without making your life worse. I think in essence they are scared of letting go of power. Yeah,
I agree 100%. And just It's interesting, you know, the term for athletes on the IOC is 8 years. Honestly, I mean, it's so complex, it takes a couple of years to get your head around what is actually going on. And once you do get comfortable and you start engaging with, you know, some of the key players in the movement, you have, you know, then you start getting some effective input. Next year, I finish up in Tokyo, so I'm comfortable and have really good relationships. But I finish up, and you get another bunch of athletes coming through and have to go through the same process. So, once you upskill athletes in those that have had the opportunity to learn, I think there's got to be some way of keeping those athletes involved, so you get that continuity going forward.
Well, it is a speculative question, right? And I'm just trying to think in both directions. So I started thinking maybe the athletes are not precisely enough presenting on where the sport governing bodies really fail to represent their position in order to make clear for the last person on this earth that they don't do. So just a starting point for thinking.
Who want to? Is here Michael?
One missing one response. Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, of course.
Sorry,
I would say if you look at the people in charge, how old are they? How long are they in the system? I think that's a problem. Yeah, they are a different generation. They're used to different structures, and they don't want to change. They profit from the current system. Why would they change?
Which is interesting because I'm actually saying athletes should be involved longer and have longer terms.
No, I'm not talking about the athletes.
No, but the athlete will then become that person who's been in the federation forever.
Yeah. Okay.
Paulina, my last question, which is really key, is what do you think the solution is? How do we get there? From your perspective, athletes, how do we get to that 50% rightful position from your perspective? I mean, you're in it every day. Like, how do we get there? And Athletes Germany's done it and is moving forward, but how do we get there as a global community?
First question would be if Giel and James are actually going for 50% representation.
Yeah.
Because I'm not sure if that was expressed from your point.
Yeah, why not? I think it is. Let's make it 60. No, but in all seriousness, I think there needs to be a seat at the table, a significant seat at the table, and that's not one seat out of many.
But then it has to be 50%. Otherwise, it's not a.
It could be veto power.
Yeah.
And I think there are other stakeholders as well, though.
Yeah.
As well.
Yes.
And I think your remark just now is very good. I think we could make more clear what is really important to us, because if 20 things are important to us, we're not going to get that. But if we start focusing at a couple of things, that might help. And one thing I take from organizations like unions is if you have a professionalized group of people working for the athletes, you get much more continuity. You don't have the issue then that you leave after a certain period. So you get a much more stable and knowledgeable representation. I think that could be a possible solution.
I think from my perspective, I think momentum, the more success athletes have in helping federations or helping bodies to progress, there is a momentum aspect. But just to Giel's point of having professional representation, we're in a fortunate position of having the staff of the IOC who are there in a continuous fashion, so there is a certain amount of continuity there as far as knowledge.
Yeah, that's definitely true, but you don't get to pick them. That's the issue.
Yeah.
And they are not independent. That's also an issue.
No, well, but they're helping support the athletes.
Okay.
Yeah, that's
They're on the
true.
commission.
Okay. So we have just a few minutes left, and we already have a question from Michael and then Jens. So please, if you could keep it.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I almost feel embarrassed. It was actually more interesting to hear the discussion there. No, quick comment and maybe a question to all of you, because influence could mean a lot of things. And for the governance group, where I was also a part to a certain extent, the WADA governance group, that was a big discussion amongst NADOs and I think also amongst WADA Ethics Commission, because it's not necessarily doesn't necessarily mean that you have a lot of influence if you have, let's say, 1 seat at the foundation board, or 2 seats or 3 seats, because still only a big minority there. So there are other ways of having influence. Have you been discussing that amongst, I mean, it goes for all of you. What is influence? I mean, it's a big question, probably difficult to answer short, but still.
You're absolutely right. There's more ways to have influence, just as there is more ways to be representative. I think in the end, we need to work on other angles. It's, for instance, now we're going to get seats at every standing committee, so that's a way forward. That's a good reform. But in the end, it does come down to sometimes, are you able to influence the decision making in a meaningful way? And at the moment, we can only do this informally, not formally.
Would you like to add something? Researchers from the origin?
Oh, no, yeah.
I might get back to your question on how to get there. So in my last presentation at Play the Game, I showed Usain Bolt with fingernails painted in the rainbow colors. And I was wondering what happened if he painted his fingernails. So I think, and going back to the analysis, we've heard that sport governance is crisis-based. We need the top-level athletes to jump on board for the athlete's voice, because they really have the power to cause serious damage in terms of money and in terms of prestige to the sport governing bodies.
Well, I would regard that as a very special starting point, that you pick those who would cause damage. I think there is a dilemma inherent in that we have to analyze, and that is that most, not the IOC, not WADA, but the international federations are actually membership organizations. The membership democracy does not work. But putting 50% athletes on the committees also would, in my view, you would carry great risk of having only elite athletes. And that would at least not change the situation, I would suspect, right now, where so much money is thrown into elite sport, so much focus on so much attention is thrown at elite sport, and very little on sports development on the ground. So I would actually think that it would not be a complete athlete representation. Unless we find models of communication, it's not just a question of elections and so on, it's also, as you point to, communication, other channels of having your voices heard. But it's pretty complex. It's just a thought that if we want the governance to improve of these, in principle, democratic federations, we also have to take that side of the coin seriously.
Any comments to that? Is it possible to represent all athletes, including grassroots?
How do you define athletes?
I'm just asking questions. You're the panelist.
I think it is. I think it is possible to represent all athletes. I mean, there's all different bodies from the professional leagues to we heard a lot about underage athletes and representation. I think it is possible to represent all athletes. And to my point in my presentation, that it's not one or the other model. It's all of the models working together in collaboration, and that's how you can get total representation.
Well, I think everybody has a different definition of representation. For instance, in the survey we sent out, there was a lot of confusion about with the US-based athletes, because athletes representation means something completely different here, apparently. So just to figure out what we are talking about is hard enough. So to find a comprehensive model for everything is going to be very hard. I think we need to find the best possible solution, and I think we need to take into account that nobody is going to be fully satisfied with the answer.
Is there any last pressing questions that someone would like to ask before we go to lunch? No. That was not to disencourage you. Not to decide not to.
Conversation keeps.
Okay. And for the panel, is there anything else that you would like to add, a final word that you were not able to share with the audience during this session?
I'd just say it's just in general to the conference. It's been fantastic to come along to the conference. It was quite challenging coming from the IOC, and I think the same for Kiel from WADA as well on various times. But to actually talk to a lot of you and be involved in went to all of the sessions that I could. I've come away with a notepad full of points, of questions to ask, of things to try and push through. So I think I've thoroughly enjoyed it.
I agree with that.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. And participation is very appreciated from everyone. So thank you. We now go for lunch.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.